Amigos de Aldea Financiera, bienvenidos a esta edición del programa. Estamos muy contentos el día de hoy porque tenemos una entrevista extraordinaria. Nos acompaña Stephanie Hare. Ella es investigadora, comunicóloga y autora de un libro extraordinario que se llama Technology is not neutral, a short guide to technology ethics. En otras palabras, la tecnología no es neutral. Es una guía corta para la ética en la tecnología. Stephanie, we are very glad to have you here in Aldea Financiera. Welcome.
Muchas gracias.
Un placer. Thank you very much for accepting the interview. And as a first question, I would like to ask you, as an introduction for all the people that is watching, if you can tell us a little something about your career, about you. Who is Stephanie Hare?
Thank you, with pleasure. So my name is Stephanie Hare, and I am an independent researcher and broadcaster. I do a lot of television and radio reports, largely for the BBC, but I am independent. And I'm also the author of a new book about technology ethics, which looks at a sort of key question that affects everybody, which is how do we build and create and use technology that maximizes the benefits and minimizes the harms. So it's a very short book. It's very accessible. It's written so that anyone can understand it. If you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're a young person, or just starting out in your career, but also if you're a senior executive or government policymaker, it's really for everybody because technology is so democratic. It's something that we all use. So we all have an interest in making sure that it's ethical.
That's very important because technology is giving a lot of opportunities for doing things that may not be the right things to do for government, for people that has the power in order to do something about it. And I will ask you, how come is that you're so interested in technology? How that born in you? How that started with you?
So I didn't study to be an engineer or a computer scientist in high school or university. I was very much focused on the humanities and on literature and languages. So it's probably an odd path, but I came of age and finished my university studies right around the early 2000s at the dot-com boom era. So I grew up in the United States, so good neighbor and friend of Mexico.
Yes.
And technology was this really exciting field, I think, in a way that was becoming very interesting for young people. So all of my friends were studying computer science and going to work with the big companies that we all know today. I took a different path and went to France, and that was the country I wanted to study and the languages that I wanted to learn, the literature and the history. And even then I started using the internet for my research, which sounds completely basic now, but really wasn't in 1998, 1996 to 1998. It was pretty unusual as a researcher to be emailing. I was researching agricultural policy, which I know sounds really boring, but I loved it. And I was emailing farmers all over the world and conducting interviews with them and asking them questions. And I was able to get information that other people couldn't get to come up with reports that I was then delivering to the French government. And it was so fun that it made me think technology is actually a really useful tool as a researcher. I need to not just be in the library or in the archives. I need to be out in the field and I need to be talking to people. And this is a way to do that. So I think it sort of started from there. And then I went to Accenture, which used to be known as Anderson Consulting, and their headquarters happened to be in my hometown in Illinois, just outside of Chicago. So I had a few friends who worked there, and they said at the time, they're taking anybody who's got good grades and interesting prospects, but you don't have to have trained as an engineer. They will train you. And my dad is an engineer by training and had been working in the IT sector and was saying, this is great. You're going to get paid to learn. Go. So I was, I think, 24 at the time, still pretty young. And so off I went, and I got absolutely fantastic training at Accenture and met some really interesting people and got to work in teams with engineers on really interesting projects. And I started to appreciate how fascinating data is and the importance of being able to improve productivity or spot problems or create opportunities because you have better data or because you're able to speed up a process or make it more efficient. And then you can, add value or extract value. I love problem solving both on my own, but I really love problem solving with a team. And when you are with a team and then you're working with your client is actually part of the problem solving team too. So I understood that this skill set was transferable and that I could work with governments, I could work with the private sector, I could decide to work on just energy or finance. You can apply technology, particularly digital technologies, to anything. And so that, I think, really inspired me to start taking it more seriously.
That's very interesting. And you're right, the technology can be applied to almost everything. And why do you think technology is not neutral?
So I used to think it was neutral. Part of changing my mind happened while writing the book. I had a hypothesis that it might not be neutral, but I needed to test it. And that's what writing the book was all about. I think because particularly in digital technology, you're often made to think this is mathematics, or this is hard sciences. So it's objective truth. And this has nothing to do with what you would expect to see in the liberal arts and sciences or the social sciences and humanities, which is where, truth is a much more contested topic. And it's a topic of debate. And we understand that politics will be a factor, or that ethics, which is this question of values, is a factor. I think when you're immersed in the hard sciences and mathematics, there's a belief that that's more objective. And I think that hypothesis or that belief was really tested for quite a lot of people, really in the past 20 years. I mean, there's scholars who've always argued against this, but I'm talking just for ordinary people on the street, as we all started seeing some of the effects of these technologies and how it was changing our lives. And so you could argue, for instance, that artificial intelligence is neutral in that it's just a technology, and what matters is how we use it. But that argument doesn't really hold up when you start going, well, what is artificial intelligence? How does it work? It needs data. Okay, well, who creates that data set? A human being is involved in creating it. And that means they have to make choices. Well, who's making those choices? Are they the right choices? So it instantly becomes philosophical just from the very outset. And then it remains philosophical the whole way through. How are you applying it? Can you find out how algorithms work, or is it a mystery? Is it a mystery because we genuinely don't know in the case of neural networks? Or is it a mystery because it's somebody's intellectual property and they won't open up their algorithms to be audited? And that matters in the public sector, obviously, in some ways more than the private sector. So if you've got governments using AI to make decisions about citizens in a liberal democracy, that needs to be accountable and transparent. So I think that was sort of where I got started with it, really, was thinking this isn't neutral at all. It's all involving raw materials. It's all involving labor market disputes. It involves talent of who is picked and hired in teams for research or for companies and who is not. And then the impact of technologies is not neutral. So the same technology can have a really different impact on you versus me, depending on what country you're in or what population group you're in because of your age or your socioeconomic status, your race, your gender, your sexuality, all of that. So the more I looked, the more I was like, oh God, this is massive. And what was really exciting was to then begin the research project. You have to do the literature review, and you learn that there are in fact so many scholars and journalists and other people, activists, etc., who've already been working on this for a really long time. I just hadn't seen it trickling through into my work in the private sector. And so I wanted to kind of build a bridge between what I was finding in the research community and what I was seeing practically applied in the technology sector. So the book is really practical. It's not like a boring theoretical book. It's super practical. I wrote it so that you could use it as a tool for yourself as somebody who uses technology, which is probably most of us, but it's particularly useful if you are someone who invests in it, or builds it in some way, or is responsible for deciding how it's used in your community or in your company or in your country. Or if you're a journalist looking about how do I report on this in a way that's really rigorous, I hope that the book will be helpful. It's very accessible.
I'm totally sure the book is very inspiring. Actually, in your book, you mentioned that if technology depends on the people that creates it, if that is so, how to have a well-spread, a commonly understood ethical base in their work, because of technology is so widespread and it depends on the people that is working on it. And it's like a tool. You can use a knife to eat or to harm people.
Yeah.
And it's the same with technology. It depends on the ethics and the way you use it. How do you think that will affect, and what are your thoughts around it?
So I think the point you raised about, the same tool can be used for good or harm is true for a lot of tools. Not all of them. There are some tools that I think are probably just objectively dangerous. It's, like the nuclear bomb is a great example of that. I'm not really sure there's any other use for it other than mass destruction. But there's other ones, the knife or the fork, you could use them to eat your dinner, or you could use them to murder someone. Probably at dinner, you could use them to murder someone that you're dining with. So what do you do in that case? And that was a really interesting thing of thinking, do we need to regulate or think ethically about the creation of knives and forks? Maybe in terms of like environmental, you might want to think about ways that you could source those so that they're like ethical in a climate sense, but probably
Correct.
not. In that case, you don't necessarily need to regulate the tool as much as the use. So we don't regulate knives and forks for eating. We do regulate knives, not forks so much. That we regulate murder. We regulate physical harm. And if you happen to be using a knife or a fork to murder or commit physical harm, that's where you're going to run up against the law, right? So it becomes really interesting because we don't want to constrain innovation. We want people to be able to innovate and use tools and make stuff. So you have to think about really carefully, what is it when you're designing a tool or thinking about how to use it so that you're minimizing harm? You have to think about, do I want the inner regulation, or in fact, the real regulation, to be about the tool itself or how it's being used? And facial recognition technology is probably a really good example of that as well. You probably could come up with any number of very ethical uses for facial recognition. And then you're going to easily come up with a number of pretty horrific uses. So do we want to regulate the technology as a whole, or do we want to say, for instance, we won't ever allow it to be used on children? So like you can't use it in school, no paying for your school lunch. There's plenty of ways that children can pay for lunch without having to hand over their face data. So, we don't need that. But would you want to be able to use it to find missing children? Right? So,
Yeah.
And that sounds like an easy example, but then it's still quite troubling because you think, well, okay, to build the tool, you still need all the facial images to build the facial recognition technology tool. So how are you getting those images? Are the children consenting to that? Did the parents consent? Can a child meaningfully consent at all? Can parents meaningfully consent on behalf of their child when they probably aren't given the information that they would need to even have this discussion, right? So even when something looks easy, it's kind of like, I guess in some basic questions or examinations that you might have when you do like an introduction to mathematics or an introduction to logic and philosophy, you solve the easy problem and you're like, done. And then you're like, oh no, it was a trick. It's actually really hard once you get to the next level. None of this is ever easy. So when you ask about, well, how do we make it so that in teams, people are creating better tools and tech? I think part of the training that people have to have in high school, in university, in continuing education for executives, et cetera, is, and investors, right? People have MBAs or who are working in venture capital, public policy even as well, is they're going to have to be trained in technology ethics. And that might be part of a larger ethics curriculum, right? Because we train people all the time in risk and compliance. We recognize that that's really important because you don't want to be breaking the law. But ethics is about much more than just the law. Like the law is the bare minimum of what you should or should not do.
Correct.
Ethics is a much bigger, richer discussion. And it's about training people's critical faculties. It's about learning about other cultures and countries, which is, I know, something you and I share as a real passion and interest. You want to know, well, how is the experience of this technology or tool happening in a different political environment or in a different cultural environment? What can we learn from that? So it's developing that sort of 360-degree, three-dimensional awareness.
Right.
You are never designing in a vacuum. You're designing in a planet.
That is totally right. I love the way you see it. And I think it's a challenge that government, authorities, technology makers have to work together in order to solve it, because I think there are a lot of challenges in that area. We met at a World Government Summit in Dubai.
Yeah.
It was a very, very nice gathering where there was these big discussions around what will be the world after COVID and what will be the world with technology. They talk about cryptocurrencies. And we had a very nice conversation and over there. And can you tell us a little bit of what was your lecture on the World Government Summit? What you talk about during your conference?
Yeah, so it was a really nice discussion that we had, looking at technology ethics as something that we could roll out in education curriculum, so that, for instance, children are learning data literacy in schools a lot, because kids are, of course, online. I mean, this is the digital native generation, but they can't always understand harm or imagine harm. And there's also, just because they're children, because they haven't had the chance, to get to know the world in the way that those of us who are much older and exhausted now know it. So working to teach kids about how to develop those critical faculties so that they are engaging with technology in a way that's protecting them, but also allowing them to take the most advantage of what technology has to offer in their education and lives is great. And also empowering their teachers and thus the parents. Oftentimes when we educate children, we're actually educating a whole family about something. And of course, you can then bring the family in, because parents or siblings or grandparents, aunts and uncles might also have all sorts of really interesting things to bring to a discussion about technology ethics. And so you create a very dynamic conversation where you are empowering this next generation, because we're looking at emerging technologies of artificial intelligence, of potentially cryptocurrencies. We know we've got climate change, and that's going to involve lots of sensors, and particularly 5G and 6G telecommunications. Cybersecurity remains a daily challenge. Quantum computing is on the horizon. This world that we are going to be sending children out into often feels like a sci-fi novel. We also know there's a lot of threats facing people online, and particularly children, because a lot of the laws are not fit for purpose to protect kids. So how do we empower those children to, go through their school, go into the workforce, and really lead and pioneer and innovate for the next generation, while facing some of the biggest challenges humanity has ever faced, obviously climate change being the number one, but there's so many more, and protecting themselves and their friends and their family along the way. So I'm really focused, as much as I love being in the daily rough and tumble of technology ethics, I think a lot about the future. And one of the things that is most important to me is actually the human component of that, that next generation, equipping them, being thoughtful and mindful of them and protecting them, but also empowering them. And that was what we were talking about at the World Government Summit, was ways to do that. And we gave examples with facial recognition technology, which we've discussed here, but also like digital health tools that the pandemic has inspired, obviously social media, and economic and education opportunities for kids around the world. Their education was so disrupted in the past 2 years because of the pandemic. We know a lot of them are quite behind. How do we just use all of these things and get it so that they are ready to hit the ground running and join a workforce that can't wait to have them, because we need every kid empowered and ready to go, both for themselves and for the rest of us, because of what humanity is facing.
That I love it. It's very important what you're saying. We have a great conversation on World Government Summit. We get to know a famous guy at the moment. I didn't know he was famous after we had that conversation, but we get to know and have a very good talk with will.i.am and the World Government Summit. It was a casual conversation after your conference. And is there any thoughts in that conversation that really had an impact on you? Because we'll have so much ideas, and he's a very he's very inside in artificial intelligence. But is there something that he said that impacted you?
Yeah. So while we were all chatting afterwards, he came up and I heard an American accent and we ended up chatting. And what I loved is he just introduced himself as being from LA. He didn't say who he was, but it was very clear as everyone was around him who he was. And he just instantly launched into a discussion of technology, which he's clearly passionate about. And he said something that stuck in my mind. And that was about over a month ago. And I've actually written something in response to it. So he's not just an artist, he's also a muse, as he inspired a piece of analysis that I've done. He said that he was talking to Beyonce, as he does, and he told her, "You don't own your face."
Yes, I remember that.
And he looked me in the eye and he goes, "And you don't own your face. None of these people here own their faces. Your face can be taken and used in all sorts of different ways without your consent, without your knowledge, and there's nothing that any of us can do about this." And I have been working on facial recognition technology for many years now, trying to raise awareness of all sorts of dangers of this tech, as well as potential opportunities, but mainly I've focused on the risk side. And on the one hand, I thought, okay, sure. But on the other hand, I was like, he's not wrong. He's not wrong. And so, we came back from Dubai and I learned that an American company named Clearview AI, which is a facial recognition technology company that has built a database of over 10 billion facial images that it has scraped from the internet. So from all of our social media and online photo albums, we put those images up there to share with our family or our friends or to put on a professional website. And what Clearview AI has done is, without so much as a by, no permission, probably hasn't told you that it's done it, has taken our faces and put it into its own database and built its own facial recognition.
Wow, so dangerous.
Algorithm. They just took it. And, it's a problem because many countries around the world have since done an investigation, issued this company with a fine, and ordered it to delete the data that it took. So Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and several European Union countries have all done this. But the United States, for reasons that mystify me as an American, uses Clearview AI in law enforcement at both the federal, the state, and even local levels. So it's being used even by the US Post Office. Around 3,000 plus organizations in the United States are using Clearview AI on Americans all the time. So Clearview AI has offered its technology for free to the government of Ukraine as part of wanting to support its effort to defend itself against the Russian invasion. And so it's been using this technology to identify dead Russian soldiers and then contact their mothers on social media, which is really tricky if you want to do a technology ethics case study on something like that. And this is sort of what will.i.am inspired me to do, because by him saying, "You don't own your face," I started thinking about this and thought, my God, like our faces are now being used as a weapon of war. And none of us ever agreed to do that. We never consented to do that. We're not making money from this. Clearview AI is as a company, but we aren't. So how is any of this okay? And then there's the tricky ethical question of, we may have a very natural sympathy and solidarity with Ukraine and want to help them. But the way that this technology is being used, we may still find quite troubling, because there are ways to let somebody's mother know that their son has been killed in war that don't involve contacting them directly over social media. That's something new. Normally you would contact through the Red Cross or go through the government or something. unfortunately, war is part of being human as much as technology is. So there's always been ways to alert a family that they've lost a child in war.
Correct.
That doesn't involve what Clearview AI and Ukraine are doing. So we might find that troubling, and we might find it even more troubling if it were Russia using Clearview AI or another facial recognition technology firm to identify dead Ukrainian soldiers and phone their mothers or email contact on social media their mothers. And then this made me think, well, hold on, what if we just stop thinking about that conflict for a moment and abstract it into the future? Since it's a US company, how would the United States respond if it goes into another war scenario or conflict and it's US soldiers who are killed, who are being identified using Clearview AI, and American mothers who are being contacted on Facebook or Instagram with pictures of their dead sons and messages from American adversaries going, here's your son or daughter, because, obviously women fight in the military too. So it's more, my goal in technology ethics isn't to say what I personally think is right or wrong, because that's not particularly interesting. Like, it's just my opinion, who cares? What's more, I think, interesting for all of us is to raise the question and go, what do we think about the use of our face? Should anyone be able to take our face and use it to make money, or be a weapon of war, or anything else that we can't, turn us into a hologram or a deep fake that's suddenly talking and saying things that we never said? Like, where do you draw the line on this?
That's right.
And is it, maybe we would have a more relaxed view about this if it was a liberal democracy, but how would we feel if it was an authoritarian regime that was doing that? At what point does this become a national security issue that companies can just take our data in this way? So I raised this as an issue, and thank will.i.am for his comment, because it inspired this line of thinking that is, it's very uncomfortable. We want ethics to feel easy. We want good and bad and right and wrong to feel the way that we do when we're kids, which is, it's just so clear to children. But as we get to be older, we realize it's just a mess. And so we need everybody, in terms of being in a democracy, we need people to weigh in and think about, do we need legislation around this? Do we need regulation around this? Do we need technologists who say, I'm not building this? And I guess in the example of Clearview AI, it becomes quite tricky, because you've got a bunch of liberal democracies saying, we don't want this being used. It's a disaster. It's a massive privacy violation. I mean, Canada called it a tool of totalitarianism. So, really not pulling its punches, but its neighbor and friend and ally, the United States, continues to use it, and presumably is fine with Clearview being used by Ukraine in this way, or it could have stopped it. So it becomes a foreign policy issue very quickly as well, which is not something I'm sure any of us thought about when we created a Facebook account or an Instagram account or a LinkedIn account. So it's scary. And it, with our face, that might sound like maybe that's okay, but then what about your voice? What about your fingerprints? What about all of the ways that are possible to take data off of you that could be taken and used in ways that you never gave permission for, and that might actually harm other people, right? So that's where it becomes quite complicated, and where we all, unfortunately, I think, can't ignore it. We're going to have to start thinking about it, because it's happening.
That is totally true, and it's a critical conversation that authorities, governments, and technology users will have to address for the good sake of in the future of the technology. I love all the research that you have been doing, Stephanie. Is great how you are addressing ethics in these very important topics. Congratulations for that. It has been great having you here in Aldea Financiera. I truly thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I was so happy to meet you and keep the conversation going. We must continue.
Absolutely. I look forward to it. And it's time to say goodbye. Thank you very much. And agradezco a todo mundo en Aldea Financiera haber sido parte de esta conversación. Seguiremos hablando del tema y seguramente Stephanie Hare estará con nosotros en el futuro. Muchísimas gracias, Stephanie.
Muchas gracias.
Hasta luego y que tengan un bonito día. Ya saben, me despido deseándoles que tengan un día con tendencia positiva. Hasta la próxima.